local news source. This is live coverage of Election Night 2024.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us on our streaming platforms. The polls are just closing in Iowa here at 8 o'clock. We will bring you the latest results tonight as we get them. I'm Danielle Wagner, and we have three panelists to provide their insight and reaction tonight. First, next to me is KCRG-TV9 political analyst Megan Goldberg. She may look familiar. You've probably seen her many times in our election coverage. Next to Megan, we have Gary Grant. He's a Republican lobbyist. And our third panelist is Linn County Democratic Party Chair Brett Nilles. I want to thank you all for being here. I appreciate you giving up your election night to be with us. So thank you so much to all of you for being here. While we wait for some results to start coming in, we have an update on absentee ballots in Linn County we do want to tell you about. Auditor Joel Miller said results of the absentee ballot count are not expected until around 11:50 tonight. So we're expecting around midnight. Miller said that this delay, though, is not due to any mechanical issues. The tallying is simply taking more time than anticipated, and we do know that Linn County had reported 36,000 absentee ballots for this election. And we will talk a little bit more about early voting coming up a little bit later. But now let's start with the latest Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa poll that came out during the weekend. I want to break down that, talk with our panelists. The poll shows Vice President Kamala Harris ahead of former President Donald Trump 47 to 44%. That's a 7% change from the last poll in September when Trump held a 4-point lead. Independent women are backing Harris by a 28-point margin, and voters 65 and older were also favoring Harris. This is especially for women older than 65, with 63% favoring Harris. Democratic leaders in Iowa believe issues like abortion are the cause for the shift. However, Iowa GOP Chair Jeff Kaufman, he rejected the results, instead highlighting the Emerson College poll, which shows Trump with a 10-point lead in Iowa. So, Megan, let's start with you. Obviously, polls don't count on Election Day. As we know, what matters is people actually going out and voting. But what is your reaction to this latest poll, and maybe what should we keep in mind when it comes to polls?
So I will say, and I think I told you this earlier, in 2008 when I was living in Indiana and there was a Seltzer poll showing Obama ahead, I was a skeptic. In 2016 with the Seltzer poll, I was a skeptic. I am probably still a slight skeptic, but I should maybe have learned my lesson by now. So I think one thing to point out with the Seltzer poll that's really, really interesting compared to other polls, and the reason that hers can look so different, is that lots of other polls are doing these complicated predictive models to say, based on all of this demographic information about you, do we think that you are a likely voter? We know that voters who are more educated, who make more money, who have certain occupations, we know what likely voters look like. But what the Seltzer poll does is just ask people, are you planning to vote or not? And that's the biggest predictor that Seltzer uses to sort of say if someone's a likely voter or not. She has lots of reasons to do this. She's defended it right on national outlets. And it seems to have worked so far quite well for her, especially because, and her stance is sort of, we should just trust people when they take the poll. If they say they're going to vote, they're probably going to vote. And it means that it's a little less labor intensive for them. There's a little less uncertainty around that. And they don't have to worry about swings from election year to election year in who turns out. And that was a huge problem in 2016 because lots of people who looked at polls or on polls as unlikely voters actually turned out to vote because they are not typically people who are voting. And so Seltzer avoided that problem. And so that's one of the reasons why she can sometimes get different results.
Okay, and yeah, as we're seeing maybe different results. And when this poll came out on Saturday, I know it sent a little bit of shockwaves through some of the political world. Brett, I'd like to get your thoughts. What issues possibly do you think may be playing to Harris's favor in Iowa based on this particular polling from the weekend?
I think the thing that helped was the abortion issue, as Megan mentioned, but I also think it's a matter of what the trend has been in terms of Iowa with the Republican-controlled legislature. So I think and the governorship, I think that it's all tended to favor a change that Iowans want to see, especially Democrats, in terms of, hey, we've been down this path in terms of Republican control, and there's some things that are going on between abortion and the vouchers that are issues that Democrats are starting to say, we really want to see a change. And so then when all of a sudden Kamala Harris comes on, it's a matter of here's another option that we should explore. So I think Democrats have been waiting to see something happen, and this kind of lends to that.
I think what maybe surprised me is because neither candidate, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, has been actively campaigning in Iowa. So it was interesting to me to possibly see that shift with this poll, even though the candidates aren't making stops in the state. Gary, as a Republican lobbyist, give us your take on the poll.
Well, I think everybody likes to highlight polls that favor them, and
Sure.
why
wouldn't you?
and discount polls that don't. So while the Seltzer poll has been, historically much more reliable than some of their counterparts, I just would encourage everybody to kind of take a breath. And none of the polls that we see or that I've seen in this election, regardless of where they were conducted, were outside of their margin of error. So could it be right? Sure. I tend to doubt it a little bit, simply because as you mentioned, there was no major campaigning, no major surrogates for either campaign showing up in Iowa. There was a tremendous amount of direct mail and television ads, but I find such a swing to be a little odd, considering that there's been no major campaigning by either one in the state. I mean, if the vice president had showed up, if the former president had showed up, you might be able to sort of see a swing of those kind of numbers. But I think with no major surrogates and no major candidate campaigning in Iowa, I'd be a little skeptical.
Well, we're going to, Brett, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Gary's made some good points, but I think the enthusiasm factor is what's reflected in those numbers that we haven't seen in terms of, we got Donald Trump again, or it's a Joe Biden. Now all of a sudden we have something new and refreshing to look at in terms of possible candidate.
Let's take a look at some of the states that have already been called in the presidential election. I believe we have a graphic that we're going to take a look at. All right, so here are the 2024 presidential election results so far. So the dark states are the ones that have been called. So you're looking there, it looks like a lot of red currently in the South, specifically for the states that have been called, and in the Northeast. So not what we're used to seeing this, I guess, this early in the presidential election. So again, we're looking at the map. The darker states are the ones that have already been called. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the congressional races in the state of Iowa. We have the District 1 race, which is Republican incumbent Marionette Miller Meeks being challenged by Democrat Christina Bohannon. This is a rematch from 2022. And I believe one of our reporters, Molly Swain, she is live with the Bohannon campaign tonight, and she actually has a campaign volunteer with her. Molly?
That's right, I am at Big Grove in Iowa City. The room has filled up now, and I've been talking to a bunch of people tonight, including volunteers, and one of those volunteers is Miss Elite Anderson. Thank you so much for talking to me this evening. Elite, could you tell me how you've been involved in the campaign?
I've been involved in the campaign by volunteering. I was a volunteer. I did a lot of knocking on the doors, but I also did transportations, like taking people to go vote. The people didn't have a cars, so.
Why was this campaign, the Bohannon campaign, something that was important to you to give your time to? Why was this the one that you chose?
First of all, I am in field of education. Christina Bohannon is a professor, so I think I was so proud when she ran to be a congresswoman, and so I needed her to do this for maybe she can help education education in Iowa.
So you kind of mentioned, I was going to ask, what are the issues that were most important to you? Sounds like education is one. What other issues were you thinking about this election?
I'm also thinking about, I'm Christian. I'm also thinking about immigrants because I'm one myself, even so I am a citizen now, but I came here 27 years ago. And so I think Christina, as a professor, she has taught so many immigrants at the University of Iowa, and so I think she might have that compassion for immigrants.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing your time and answering my questions tonight.
I also like watching KCRG all the time. It's my favorite channel.
I did not tell her to say that. Thank you so much, Elite. Have a nice night. I'll send it back to you guys in the studio.
Thank you so much. Again, that was Molly Swain reporting for us live from the Christina Bohannon campaign in Iowa City tonight. We're also going to check in just a minute with our reporter with the Marionette Miller Meeks campaign in Riverside. I'm told that Brian is there at the campaign, so let's hear from Brian.
Danielle, we are at the ballroom at Riverside Casino right now, where doors are just opening as the polls are closing. You can see some people are starting to trickle in here very slowly, starting to get their food, watching as the election results are starting to come in. We did get word that the Congresswoman is here at the casino. She's not in the actual ballroom just yet, but they are all watching the election results as of right now. We did know and learn earlier this afternoon that Miller Meeks did have a busy morning. She was at Pella, as well as Fairfield and Tipton, all making a last-minute push for noon. Again, they're just getting to eat.
That was Brian Tabak reporting from the Marionette Miller Meeks campaign tonight at the casino there in Riverside. As I mentioned, this is a rematch. Miller Meeks defeated Bohannon in 2022. Brett, I want to start with you this time. Do you think Bohannon can win this time around in this rematch?
I think the advantage that she has this time is it being a presidential election year where the turnout is much higher, and I think that tends to favor Democrats historically. So I think between that and more student involvement is what I've heard, that might make the difference this time.
Yeah. Gary, what are your thoughts on this?
I think to Brett's point earlier, I think if we're going to see a race in Iowa, that the enthusiasm gap sort of, or if there's an enthusiasm gap, this is the race that we're likely to see it in. I know that the Democrats need nationally 4 seats to regain control of the House. The Iowa 1st and 3rd, there's 2 races in Virginia, and then there's, I think, 3 House races in New York that the national parties have kind of concentrated a good deal of resources in. So we've seen quite a bit of spending by not just national parties, but outside interest groups. So if there is an enthusiasm gap, this is the race that we might see it in.
Megan, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit here. So about a month ago, analysts with Cook Political Report showed this race was shifting from leaning Republican to being a toss-up. At that time, we talked to you, and you told TV9, I'm going to quote you here.
Oh, good.
It's really not often that incumbents lose. They have an extremely high re-election rate. But in a district like District 1, it's probably the most likely place you would see it happen. So my question is, do you still feel that way tonight?
So I still think that Marionette Miller Meeks is a relatively weak incumbent. The incumbents have a huge advantage. They're reelected at astronomical rates in the U.S. For Congress. But as we know, so she hasn't been in Congress that long. Her initial victory was very, very narrow.
Right.
And I think the other thing that, as Brett has already said, it's a general election, which means turnout is higher. And it includes the University of Iowa. In 2020, lots of students weren't even on campus to vote. Or it was also hard to mobilize them to vote because you were trying to get them to vote absentee. They were nervous about COVID and going to the polling place. That's all gone. And so what I've heard from folks sort of working with the University of Iowa students, first of all, they have an entire course devoted to get out the vote. Cornell does too. Ours is on a much smaller scale since we're a smaller school. But we are talking about them registering thousands of voters in the district. And the district is big, but that's a huge amount. And I think that Bohannon has really made a strong effort to engage with the college Democrats on campus and with other groups on campus. And she's sort of like on the ground in Iowa City a lot. And those young voters, especially if they're mobilized to turn out for Harris, and Bohannon is sort of putting herself out there in, not obviously they're both Democrats, but sort of associating herself with that enthusiasm to make sure those students are still voting in down ballots. I think that could make a big difference in what was already going to be a close election.
Well, you brought up a great point about kind of the district. It covers Iowa City, Johnson County, Scott County. Marinette Miller-Meeks had previously, in the last election, won Scott County, whereas Bohannon took Johnson County. So those two counties will play a big factor in this. This election, this race specifically between Miller-Meeks and Bohannon, what kind of stood out to me watching our channel, as I do, the political ads, and I seem to see more attack ads with this race. Do either of you have a thought on that, or maybe the strategy behind those ads in this particular campaign? They ranged from prescription drug prices, abortion, backing law enforcement, just to name a few of those campaign ads that we saw. Gary?
Well, I think if you survey voters, everybody, almost to a person, they're going to tell you they hate negative ads. The problem with that is the reason they're still used is they work. They're useful in defining a candidate, they're useful in, or an opponent, they're useful in sort of, taking someone's vote out of context. I mean, you can see, in the tiny little script at the bottom of their screen, they'll reference the vote, but if you blink, you'll miss it usually. But yeah, I'm not surprised by that with the amount of outside money that comes in, and they of course can't, neither candidate can control independent expenditures. They can't coordinate with them, so a lot of times some of those candidates may not know some of those ads are coming. But yeah, they're used because they work, unfortunately.
Yeah, Brett, what are your thoughts on what you saw?
I think it is a matter of all the outside money, and they're not held accountable as much as the candidates are. So unfortunately, they can make accusation attacks that the candidates themselves probably wouldn't do if it was up to them. And so if we had a better way to monitor all the outside influences that are coming into these districts, I think we'd have much better campaigns.
And this campaign specifically, you mentioned a lot of money coming in because there's a chance that it could possibly flip from Republican to Democratic, which would play a role in the U.S. House. Megan, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Of course, we've done fact checkers on many of these political ads, but you also have to trust that the voters are going to go out there and hopefully find the accurate information themselves.
Yeah, so I think there's a good news, bad news situation here for sort of democratic deliberation. One is that in the sort of like mid-2000s, late 2000s, there's a whole book called In Defense of Negativity, where a Vanderbilt political scientist wrote about how everyone hates negative ads. However, they contain often more specific policy-relevant information than positive ads. That lots of folks, when they run a positive ad, it is, in the words of my students, is vibes only. It is about, sort of it's sort of generic value statements, but that can mean a lot of things when it comes to how you're voting on policy. Negative ads are going to reference, however briefly, with a citation, they're going to reference specific votes people have, they're going to reference policies. The bad news is that fact-checking does not often work.
Okay.
So I think it's a really valuable tool. One of the problems is often when we're fact-checking, we have to, by the nature of fact-checking, repeat whatever claim was in the ad. And it turns out sort of just like our psychological processes, what sticks with us is the thing we hear more than once. And so when you repeat something that's in the ad, and they've maybe already seen the ad, you're also sort of recirculating the ad to people who wouldn't have otherwise seen it.
Okay, that's a good point. Maybe we should not be doing these fact checkers.
So it's sort of, it's really, there's a tension because obviously the media plays a role in providing that sort of information.
Yes.
And providing accountability that maybe candidates will, so right, that's the mechanism that like maybe there's good news is that maybe a candidate doesn't want to be fact checked, and so right, they avoid making claims that are going to be the target of fact checks. But it's really, really hard psychologically when it comes to misinformation to correct that information.
Okay.
And so that's sort of the downside. But negative ads can contain more sort of policy information. We have also seen there's an increase in negative ads overall, but also an increase in what we call contrast ads, where, and again, this is both by the campaigns and outside spending groups, where you're getting both. You're getting sort of the negative side of the opponent and the positive side. And so that's becoming more common. And so maybe people are not quite as frustrated by them.
Well, again, we're talking about Congressional District 1 between Marionette Miller Meeks, the Republican incumbent, and challenger Christina Bohannon for the second time. We'll probably come back to this one and have more to say. But I want to move on to Congressional District 2 now. That's between Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson and Democratic challenger Sarah Corkery. And we have our reporter Jackson Valenti live at Spare Time in Cedar Rapids with Ashley Hinson's campaign tonight. Jackson.
Yeah, guys, I mean, Hinson isn't here yet. If you look at the stage behind me, it is still empty, but in the past 30 minutes, this place has really started to come alive. If you look over here with me, a lot of people have started to show up, and this is just one small part of the venue here. Probably a good 150, 200 people here at this point. I mean, a lot of people are out here for this party, and when I go around asking people what they think about this race, I kind of get a bit of two answers. People say, yeah, we're not going to call this race until every single vote is tabulated. Other people, on the other hand, say they think this race is going to be a slam dunk. Polls haven't projected this race to be particularly close at this point. Hinson has a fairly dominant lead. She came out of her race in 2022 with a fairly sizable lead there as well, and polls project a similar size or even bigger lead this time around. Now, when you actually look around and ask people what they're stressing about, they're looking at the Miller-Meeks race, they're looking at Bohannon, and they're looking at that Nunn race, and of course the presidential race as well. So while people are pretty confident in this race here, I wouldn't say that people are calm. People are definitely still stressing about that national election. There is a lot of news behind us about each state, how each state's going. You know, people are looking around it eagerly. Some people are happy with some of the races they've seen, but at the same time, nobody is going to be content until they get some results here. But we'll keep getting more results, and we'll tell you everything as we get that information. Live in Cedar Rapids, Jackson Valenti, KCRG-TV9 News.
Jackson, thank you so much for your reporting tonight. And again, he is with Ashley Hinson's campaign. She's being challenged by Democrat Sarah Corkery. Hinson is seeking a third term in office, while Corkery, this is her first time running for any office, and I know she had kind of mentioned to us that she entered the race because she had breast cancer, and this was something that kind of inspired her to run in the race. Megan, we're coming up on a time that we're going to take a break. I just want to get your thoughts real quickly on this race, and then we'll come back to it after the break.
So I think, I have lots of thoughts on the race generally, but to pick up on what you just said, Corkery entering the race because she had breast cancer and sort of her experiences with healthcare in the U.S. is actually very typical of why women often enter politics. It's not sort of in general their political ambition, but they often feel like there was some experience, and it's women who are not part of these sort of traditional pipelines to office where, they go to law school and then they practice law for a while and then they run for state house and then Congress, but it's because they are invested in an issue. All
right, and again, we will talk more about this race coming up, but for now, we're going to send it to Des Moines and Gray's Media Iowa Capitol Bureau.
Bizarre.
KCRG update at 7.
Someone's talking. Mic check. Yeah, we are taking a very, very early look at district.
Welcome to this live update on election night. I am Beth Malicki with KCRG-TV9, and we first of all want to start off with some information we are just now getting from the Lynn County Auditor, Joel Miller. He said due to the quantity of early voting, those absentee ballots, they're going to be delayed in reporting results tonight. He says he knows this is inconvenient, but he doesn't want to sacrifice the integrity of the vote. Miller said, quote, "The delay in absentee ballot results is not due to any mechanical issues. The tallying of absentee ballots is simply taking more time than anticipated." Miller said the counting of absentee ballots started this morning at 8:30, and he's expecting results to come from Lynn County tonight at 11:50. We want to get you caught up on all of the races that matter most to you. Let's start off with that all-important race for president. We're going to bring you the numbers again. The polls here in Iowa just closed about 25 minutes ago, and that is when we saw just the first inkling of numbers start to come through. Iowa reliably red. 4 years ago, Donald Trump came out ahead. In 2016, he had a very strong showing, double digits in the state of Iowa. Then this past weekend, that Seltzer poll that Des Moines Register sponsors, it seemed to send shockwaves not just around Iowa, but the nation. It showed that Kamala Harris was coming out in front right here in Iowa. We talked to many Republicans who said that vote is just, or that poll rather, is an outlier. And really, the one you should be paying attention to is the Emerson poll that showed Donald Trump with a very comfortable lead in the state of Iowa. Polls don't matter on a day like today. What matters is you, the voter. What did you decide to do? We are getting those results from county auditors all across the state. You can always get up-to-the-minute information on our website, KCRG.com. Right now, I want to bring in my colleague, TV9's Becky Phelps, who's looking at these numbers and breaking them down to make sense of them at the county level. Becky?
Polls just closed at 8 o'clock, but we are starting to get a few vote numbers in so far. We're going to take a look at District 2. That's Hinson versus Corkery. And we have just a couple of votes in, but there are some interesting things happening, particularly in Cerro Gordo County. So we have about 40% of the votes counted there. And Corkery is neck and neck with Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson, about 49.6 to 49.2. And that's particularly interesting because in 2022, when Hinson faced off against Liz Mathis, the Democratic challenger there, Hinson had a large lead in many of the rural counties and kept it very close in Black Hawk County and Lynn County, where Mathis carried a more Democratic lead. So if Corkery can keep up any kind of close numbers in these rural counties and start to carry Lynn County and Black Hawk County, she could have a chance of making this a very tight race with Hinson. Again, these are still very early numbers with just a few counties reporting, so we will continue to keep you updated as those votes come in. Beth, back to you.
Becky, thank you so much. We also want to take your attention on something that has recently come in. In the state of Iowa, the race for president, about 10% of the votes are counted, so it's almost like those poll numbers. It's too early for it to count, and it really doesn't matter until we really know the outcome. But these early numbers, with just 10% of the vote counted, I can tell you that Kamala Harris is ahead with 57.7% of the vote just here in Iowa, compared to Donald Trump, 41.2%. Now, Becky Phelps has been looking at those presidential numbers, and I wonder if we could take a look at her screen, because she has those numbers I was talking about. Becky, walk us through those, please.
Right, like you said, 57.7 for Harris, 41.2 for Trump. We are having a lot of early reporting coming in Polk County, and that's probably where a lot of that Harris lead is coming from. Beth, back to you.
All right, more updates later. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for staying with us on our streaming platforms. Again, I'm Danielle Wagner, joined by our three panelists. We have KCRG-TV9 political analyst Megan Goldberg, Gary Grant, Republican lobbyist, and Brett Nilles, the chair of the Lynn County Democrats. Again, thank you to our panelists for spending election night with us. Before the break, we were talking about District 2, which is between incumbent Republican Ashley Hinson and Democratic challenger Sarah Corkery. And we were talking a little bit about how this is Corkery's first time running for office. And you can see the district there on your map. It includes the cities of Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Dubuque, and Decorah. Correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't sound like they were thinking that this would be one of the congressional districts, Megan, that may flip this time around?
Yeah, so I think this is generally considered a fairly safe race for Hinson. But I do think that that's interesting compared to where this district has been in the past, right? It includes urban areas like Cedar Rapids. It includes places that have certainly shifted to the right, but have been sort of important areas of support for Democrats like Dubuque. And so it's a really interesting sort of example, I guess, in contrast to these other races where we have competitive seats. And so I think that in the future, it's a seat that could potentially, especially depending on what happens this year, it could be competitive. Okay. But it also requires a lot of resources probably that come from the national party. And those resources don't always come, even if it's a challenger who could mount a good campaign.
And Gary, talk a little bit about this race for us. Again, Hinson is seeking her third term in Congress.
Yes, this, like you mentioned, I don't think this is a race that was on either party's radar for the resources. I know that it seems to me, just sort of from the outside, that the Republicans may have poured more resources into this than the Democrats did, because they have been really all in on the first and the third. As kind of bellwether for not just the state, but critical for them if they want to pick up 4 seats to control the House. So I don't think that the resources were there. I mean, there's a finite amount of resources to run national campaigns. Even third-party money runs out at some point. So I just don't think that there were the resources put into that one that would have may have made it competitive, or more competitive than I think we'll see it tonight.
And we did mention, again, this is Corkery's first time running for any political office, and we talked about the power of incumbency, but also the name recognition, because with the first district race with Bohannon, even though she lost before, she also maybe has a little bit of that name recognition, where Brett, maybe Sarah Corkery doesn't have as much name recognition coming into this race.
Oh, that's for sure. Sarah Corkery, came out of nowhere essentially to become the candidate for this district, and have to admire her for that. But that's the challenge when Liz Mathis lost 2 years ago with a lot of resources and the support for the DCCC Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, that her losing with so much name recognition in Waterloo and Cedar Rapids area, for then somebody to come from Cedar Falls who is in marketing and not an elected official at all, to try and mount a campaign, a competitive campaign, really became hard. So I admire her for that. But you never know. We have to wait until all the votes are counted. I think it would really be something that we'd be really surprised by. But when nobody else in this district wanted to come forward and run, just because they knew it was going to be hard running against an incumbent like Ashley Hinson. But we wanted a candidate, and she's doing the very best she can with limited resources, so we'll have to see what happens. But it would be quite a surprise, but you never know.
Yeah, you never know. That's why we'll wait to see all the results come in tonight. We talked about the political ads in the District 1 race. I want to briefly mention the political ads in this race. Gary, you had touched on it. Maybe not as much national resources coming into this race for the Democratic candidate because they were going to the other races. I didn't see a lot of ads in the beginning specifically for this race. And then when I did see ads, specifically Ashley Hinson ads, she never mentioned Corkery in her ads. It was just her, and talking also about crossing the aisle. Megan, what do you make of the approach that she took, Ashley Hinson, with the campaign ads this year?
I think this is actually sort of classic ad strategy. If you are an incumbent, there is no reason for you to go negative first. Typically, challengers will go negative first, especially underdogs. But if you think about the position that Hinson's in, she already has a lot of name recognition, both from being the incumbent and from her previous career. So she has lots of publicity. There's no reason for her to ever say Sarah Corkery's name out loud, because that just raises her name recognition. And so instead, she's going to focus on what she's done for the district, and she can afford to do that because she is already sort of in this advantageous position.
Gary, do you think she had the right strategy and the right approach?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with Megan. I think that there's no reason for Ashley Hinson to sort of to use her campaign dollars to boost Sarah Corkery's name ID. The other strategy behind sort of, backloading those ads is the sort of traditional school of thought on ads is once you go up, you have to stay up. So it's a function of how much money you have. So that's the reason you don't see a lot of television from candidates or committees, in August. You start seeing them in, mid-September to late September, and it's a function of money, because I think you don't want those blackout periods before the election. You don't want to run out of money before Election Day. I mean, on my way here, I was listening to the radio. I'm still hearing campaign commercials. So this is, they're going to be on the air up until probably 8 o'clock. I think.
Not over just yet. But you brought up a great point about money, and Brett, there probably just wasn't as much money in the Corkery campaign. I did see one political ad. You took it from, I believe, the debate that was between them talking about reproductive rights.
Yeah, so the flip side of being a challenger is then you want to mention your opponent's name to offer that contrast. So I think that's what Sarah's campaign commercial focused on, with the picture of Ashley during the debate, and then Sarah on the one side bringing up the issue of abortion. So that kind of goes along the same idea of the incumbent's not going to put anybody's name out there except for their own, and then the challenger is really going to focus on trying to offer a contrast between the two.
Sure. So we've talked about the 1st and 2nd congressional district races tonight. Let's talk a little bit about the 3rd district, another race that's considered a toss-up. Again, the 3rd congressional district between Republican incumbent Zach Nunn and Democratic challenger Lanaan Beckham. This district includes southern Iowa and Des Moines. Nunn is seeking a 2nd term, and in 2022, Nunn narrowly defeated then incumbent Cindy Axne. Beckham has worked at the USDA under Tom Vilsack. And the Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa poll that we've been talking about tonight had a 7 percentage point lead for Beckham. And we've been talking about the political ads. This race has seen millions spent on television advertisements. Again, probably goes back to the point that this district, there you see it, District 3, is another one that is considered a toss-up. Brett, what are your thoughts with the newcomer, Lanaan Beckham?
I think he's running a really strong campaign, and basically focused out of Polk County. It seems where that's where all the Democratic votes are in that district. So I think he's doing the best he can, and fortunately with the close race with Cindy Axne 2 years ago, I think that offers Democrats a little bit of hope in terms of being able to flip this district back. So I think with the additional money that's coming in there and his experience that he referred to in terms of working for Tom Vilsack, that's a benefit to him. So I think it's one to watch that you never know in terms of what happens here within the last couple of days. Polls are polls, but it really boils down to what's going to happen tonight.
And that's what we've said. Polls are polls, but people need to go out and vote. And we will see what happens tonight. Gary, what are your thoughts on this race, again, with the incumbent Republican Zach Nunn and Democratic challenger Lanaan Beckham?
Yeah, this is another one that the national parties and the national interest groups have taken an interest in, because I think that these two, the 1st and the 3rd in Iowa, and I think the 4th and the 7th in Virginia, were the ones that they were looking at as the ones they have to win if they're going to pick up those 4 seats. So yeah, we've seen millions of dollars in advertising. Both of the candidates are strong candidates. Both, combat veterans. Mr. Beckham has a really compelling personal story. Zach has a really compelling, resume. And I think this one goes down to the wire. This one is, I think, going to be the closest race in Iowa.
All right, Megan, do you agree, disagree?
Oh gosh, you know I hate doing predictions.
We don't have our magic 8 balls out here.
No, if I could get one, that would be great. Yeah, so I think that this is another race, obviously, that I agree. I think it's going to be a very close one. And I think it really illustrates, too, the way that if you're the National Democratic Party or the State Democratic Party in Iowa, that if you are being strategic about recruiting the best candidates and putting your support behind them, that you are going to go after the weakest incumbents. And in Iowa, the weakest incumbents were in those 2 districts. I think that Hinson was always going to be harder to beat. I think, Brett, the point about how close the Mathis campaign was 2 years ago, but Mathis was, by all accounts, a very, tons of resources and a really high-quality challenger, and she still lost. That's discouraging, and so I think you can see the resources poured into these 2 districts very strategically, because those are the 2 sort of most opportune moments for the party.
Okay. Right now, again, 2 of Iowa's 4 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, we've talked about getting that national attention, being some of the most competitive races actually in the nation. TV9's Iowa political director Dave Price shows us why both incumbents have the upper hand, though, in these races.
Here's why Iowa is so unique in this election year. 2 of the closest watched U.S. House races anywhere in the country are in this state. Let's take a look at them. The 1st congressional district, you have a rematch from 2 years ago. Republican Marinette Miller-Meeks trying to hold her seat against the Democrat Christina Bohannon. Now, when you look at the voter registration numbers out from the Secretary of State, you see how close this is. Registered Republicans have a 4-point advantage over registered Democrats. Again, remember that number, +4. Now, when you go to the other closely watched race in the 3rd district, again, the Republican is the incumbent, Zach Nunn, taking on Lanon Bakam, his Democratic challenger. Going by the numbers, once again, we have a +4 advantage in registered Republicans over Democrats. So both of these districts, the key for the challengers, the independent vote. For the Democrats to have a chance here, they need to get the bulk of those independents to come over to them. Obviously, for the incumbent Republicans, they also need that larger share. That could end up being the difference maker in 2 of these closely watched races on election night. In Des Moines, I'm Dave Price.
Well, Dave said it, 2 of the most closely watched races on election night. Again, District 1 and District 3, getting that national attention, which hasn't necessarily happened recently in Iowa because it's seemed to be leaning more red. And again, we pointed out a little bit earlier that neither presidential candidate campaigned in the state, but it's possible that those 2 congressional districts could flip this turnaround.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of the reason that these congressional districts can get national attention is that a vote in the House is a vote in the House. Yes. The districts are obviously all the same size. The other advantage that if what you want is national attention, the advantage Iowa has is that these media markets are relatively inexpensive. And so a lot of what, and so is, the cost of campaign staff and everything is a little less expensive in Iowa if you're comparing it to running, a tight race. On one of the coasts or in a city, it's much less expensive to pour your resources, thinking strategically if you're the national parties, into these races.
And I want to talk a little bit about early voting. More than 80 million voters cast their ballots early across the nation this year. As we touched on at the top of the hour at 8 o'clock, Linn County Auditor Joel Miller sent out a release coming up on a little bit more than 2 hours ago now, saying results of the absentee ballot count in Linn County are not expected until around 11:50 tonight. And Miller said that delay is not due to any mechanical issues. The tallying is simply taking more time than anticipated. Linn County reported 36,000 absentee ballots. I also want to point out we have not heard at this point of any significant election issues to report in eastern Iowa. There was a problem at a Des Moines precinct, and there have been issues in Story County. In a statement, Secretary of State Paul Pate's office said on the Story County issues, Quote, "We are aware of technical issues regarding tabulators in some precincts in Story County. The auditor is working with the vendor and our office to resolve it. It is not stopping anyone from casting a single ballot. It may impact how quickly we can report the results. We will follow up with information as it becomes available." So a little bit of delays possibly again in the counting tonight, and in Lynn County again with the absentee ballots. We've been talking about early voting, and nationally 80 million. That's pretty significant. I want to look at some of my stats. So around 80 million, that's compared to 101 million in 2020. Of course, that was a COVID year, so a lot more people were requesting those ballots to avoid going to the polls. And this is compared to 27 million in 2016. So it seems maybe that the trend of early voting is gaining popularity, Megan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's lots of people who like it for convenience. You know, I am an election day voter myself because I just love to go on election day. But right, I have a job that I have relatively high amounts of flexibility. I get to schedule my own days for the most part. You know, I have children who are in school, and so I can go while they're in school.
Sure.
But there are lots of people for whom getting to the polls on election day, especially if there's any sort of wait, is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
And so having polls open before the election is flexible for a lot of people, and they really like that. They also, I think there's lots of people who, if you are feeling anxiety about the election or you're nervous, they like to just go and get it over with, so they know they've participated and they've done their part.
And I know previously it seemed to be that more early voters leaned Democratic, but that may not necessarily be the trend that we're seeing this year, right?
Yeah, from my analysis, checking each day in terms of what the early vote was, Democrats in Lynn County voted almost 40% of the Democrats voted early. And our numbers this year were higher than in 2016. Okay. And even when you look at it from being a shorter period of time and more controls in terms of who can vote or what that time frame is to get an absentee ballot in, the satellite voting was tremendous, and people wanting to get out and vote early really did make a difference. And I did notice Republican numbers were up higher than prior years too. So I think that message is getting across that here's an opportunity to vote at your convenience rather than waiting until Election Day.
Right. I think we're seeing that gap narrow, where historically it's been maybe 10% more of Democrats voted early or by absentee than Republicans. I think I saw a statistic just on my way here that that gap has narrowed to like 4%. So that's nationally, that's not Iowa. So I think that's kind of an early sign that I think more Republicans than had traditionally before are adopting early voting and absentee voting.
And Megan, I think you brought up an interesting point about if maybe you're having stress about the election, you just want to vote and know it's done. And also, I think sometimes, like, God forbid, what if something happens on election day? Like, you just really never know what could happen. And speaking about maybe just a little bit of election stress this time around, we all know the rhetoric has been a little bit different for this campaign cycle. A poll from AP NORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, found 7 in 10 Americans report feeling anxious or frustrated about specifically the 2024 presidential campaign. Gary, does that surprise you at all? 7 in 10 Americans feeling a little bit anxious about tonight?
I'm not surprised by that. I think that people in both parties are becoming, they still take some of those negative campaignings to heart. There's also, unfortunately, this is not true of KCRG, but there's an increasingly sort of frustration with information that people think they're not getting from whatever media sources that they're tuned into. So, I mean, I think the best antidote for that is, get your information from several sources rather than just rely on any single source. But I think that might be the source of a lot of frustration is people are, I think, increasingly believe that there's information that they're not getting.
Right. Yeah, I think the rhetoric in terms of our ballot's going to be counted has built up some of that anxiety from people, so wanting to make sure that their votes count and that everyone has a fair opportunity to get to the ballot place and cast their vote.
Megan, what have you heard this election cycle? I mentioned you are our political analyst, but you also are a political science professor at Cornell College in Mount Vernon.
So I think there is certainly a lot of anxiety. We see it among our students. I see it among my colleagues. But I think one thing that's really noteworthy that I've seen more this cycle is sort of, if you think about voting and you think about the way in which we often hear about campaigns, it is through social media, it is through watching the news, posting on social media. And a lot of those are in some ways, even though social media is, by its nature, is sort of social in this like electronic way, this digital way. We increasingly have been isolating ourselves when it comes to engaging with politics. And so I think another important antidote to that is, broaden where you're getting information, but to also participate in the process as more than just sort of this hobby that you read about. But there are so many opportunities to be social with other people through electoral work, whether that's canvassing, going door to door. I know folks who have sat down and done postcard writing initiatives where they get together with their friends and they feel, you get that sort of like positive adrenaline rush of like you've done something positive, you have supported a candidate or a party that you believe in, but you're also not isolating yourself, and that's one of the ways I think that you can sort of counter those anxious feelings or the stress about the election.
And we do have some results tonight that we want to show you for the congressional race, U.S. House District 1. There you can see it's an estimated very small percentage of votes in. I believe that says 5.6%. So you can see Christina Bohannon has a very slight lead, again, very early in this race. Let's take a look, if we can, at U.S. House District 2. So this one also very close, and it looks like 16.8% of the votes estimated in at this point. Sarah Corkery, again, very early in this race with a narrow margin, but the percentage-wise, they're tied at 49% to 49%. Let's take a look at the presidential race. So this is Iowa specific. And it looks like we have 21.2% estimated of the votes in. And you can see Kamala Harris, again, just want to emphasize, very early in the night, and this is Iowa specific. Kamala Harris currently has the lead with 52% to Donald Trump's 46%. We are going to continue to bring you these election results throughout the night. Once we are done here, we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes, actually. You can stay watching us on all of our streaming apps on KCRG.com, as well as our news app and on YouTube. You can also catch us on KCRG-CW9.3. While we end here shortly in just a few minutes, let's bring it back to the presidential race where we started. We just saw a glimpse at what's happening here in Iowa. Megan, that is what the poll during the weekend is currently predicting, is that Harris may actually win the state of Iowa. What are you most watching for tonight in the presidential race, not only in Iowa, but around the country, because there's a lot of battleground states that the entire nation is watching very closely tonight?
So I think, sort of specific to Iowa, and this does apply to the battleground states too, I think there's a lot of interest to see how Harris does among a couple groups that have swung towards the Republicans over the past few cycles. One of those is sort of the working class voters. The other one is rural voters. I think Harris has done some work to reach out to those. She had a rural director. And so I think, and there's some, if just anecdotally, signs are not political science. I remind my students of that all the time. But there is, a shift this year in areas, and you hear this from lots of folks, that there are Harris signs in rural areas where you might not have seen them before. And that's even true in Iowa, where it is, in fact, hard to get Harris signs. And so I think that's what I'm sort of looking for, is looking at that urban-rural divide that has emerged in recent years and how it's doing this year.
Gary, what are you going to be looking for tonight, maybe in Iowa and across the country?
Well, when these votes come in, generally, it's sort of the larger areas maybe that are reporting first. Some of the ones that have the better technology than smaller rural areas. So I think Republicans are pretty used to being sort of the underdogs at the beginning of the race. So I don't know that any of us are getting too excited about sort of the races being this close. Although I think I said before, this is going to be a year where there are going to be races that are closer than people think they should be. And maybe that goes to Brent's sort of enthusiasm gap. That maybe that's proof of that. But yeah, I don't know that anybody's getting too excited too quickly now. So I think some of the rural areas, once they start coming in, I think you'll see those numbers narrow.
Brett, I want to get your thoughts before we wrap up here.
Yeah, it's hard to really get too excited about the numbers at this point because you don't know where they're from. And it could be the rural aspect coming in or it could be the urban aspect. But unless you have a better picture of where these votes are coming from, and is there a pattern there that you can kind of make a basis on in terms of this really going to be what's going to happen, or are we just waiting to see what the final results are?
Well, let's take one final look at the presidential map that we have with kind of the latest numbers with the states. So again, the darker states are the ones that have been called. So we're seeing, again, a lot of red in the south, blue in the northeast. And again, this is pretty typical, Megan, right, of what we would normally expect on election night.
Right, exactly.
So far.
Yes,
again,
and
very early.
Yep, yes, and right, a lot of those West Coast states are not going to come in for a long time because California's polls are not going to close. Well, actually, maybe I don't remember what time they close, but they're 2 hours behind us, so it'll be a minute.
Yes, and we'll again continue to watch these results as they come in. I want to thank our panelists again. TV9's political analyst Megan Goldberg with Cornell College, Gary Grant, a Republican lobbyist, and Brett Nilles, chair of the Linn County Democrats. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here tonight. I do sincerely appreciate it. And again, you continue watching on our streaming services or KCRG CW 9.3. And that'll wrap it up for us here tonight. Thank you so much.
And welcome to continuing coverage of Your Voice, Your Vote coverage. I'm Jim Mertens here with Becky Phelps, and Becky's been trying to crunch the numbers as much as possible, and we do encourage you to keep an eye on the bottom of the screen as we get to new numbers and new totals coming in. You've been following a lot of the race nationally and state by state thanks to ABC News coverage, and we're trying to cover Iowa as best we can. We really do want to keep an eye on two of the congressional races. That's the 1st Congressional District and the 2nd Congressional District, both Eastern Iowa districts. And here we can see some of the early numbers that have come in. Only 8% of the vote in District 1. This is southeast Iowa, but it shows Marinette Miller-Meeks, the incumbent, with a lead over Democrat Christina Bohannon. But once again, just a small smattering of the vote that is in so far. And I think we should just go to Becky right now because she has a way to dive a little deeper into the numbers for the 1st District House race.
Yeah, we've got a great map here that kind of explains this was expected to be a close race, but Bohannon is keeping it close in places that matter. So we'll take a look here at Jefferson County, which right now Bohannon is winning 63-36 with half of the votes in. In 2022, Miller-Meeks kept this a very, very close county, winning it by just a margin of votes, and keeping an advantage in those more rural counties is going to be important for Bohannon.
And we're still really keeping an eye on Johnson County in particular for this race, because if Bohannon can crank up the numbers of the Democrats in Johnson County, it really impacts the rest of the counties here. I don't know if we have the second district numbers that are in so far, but this is also with a little more of the vote counted, 20% of the vote in, and Ashley Hinson, the incumbent, with 51% of the vote right now, Sarah Corkery with 47%. And once again, this is with 20% of the vote in House District 2.
Sarah Corkery also keeping it tight in places that matter. Dubuque County in particular, 50 to 48 right now.
These numbers continue to be added up. We'll continue our coverage in just a moment.